Morphic resonance, morphic fields, and the extended mind. A lecture given by Dr. Rupert Sheldrake at the CFPSS Spring Conference held in Bournemouth in April 2010.
This morning, I'm going to suggest to you that the laws of nature are more like habits, that all species have a kind of collective memory. Every individual draws upon the collective memory and in turn contributes to it. I'm going to suggest that our ordinary memories are not stored inside our brains, as we're usually led to believe. And I'm also going to suggest that our minds extend beyond our brains all the time, even at this moment. Now, these are all provocative ideas, and I don't really need to say they're controversial within the scientific world. But the reason why I think we're going to have to consider them is that there's a crisis at the very heart of science. And it's one that's going to force radical change, whether we like it or not. Well, I like it, some don't, but I think it's going to happen anyway. And one of the main reasons, there are, I think, two main reasons for this. One is a clash of the most fundamental models of reality at the heart of science. The second is the complete failure of materialistic science to explain consciousness. This is a crisis. They ignored consciousness for many years, and it's only in the last 15 to 20 years that consciousness studies have become a major focus within science. The more scientists think about consciousness, the less adequate the materialist picture becomes. And consciousness studies is a ferment at the moment. It's one of the most exciting areas of science because there's no agreed model for consciousness. It's called by philosophers of mind the hard problem because no one knows how to solve it. We ought not to be conscious, it ought not to exist, and yet we are. And so this is a huge problem for science. And it, as I say, it wasn't acknowledged until recently. Well, first, the clash of paradigms or models at the heart of science. Science is based on two really fundamental models of reality which are now in conflict. The first is the paradigm or model of eternity. Nothing really changes. The second is the model of evolution. Everything changes and develops in time. And these are now in head-on conflict. The model of eternity is rooted in the thought of ancient Greece. The Greek philosophers were obsessed with eternity, the idea that there was a changeless reality behind the world we experience, which is, of course, always changing. And what was that changeless reality? Some people think they got the idea from mystical experience, that many mystics report a realm beyond space and time. But the Greek philosophers were trying to put it into intellectual theory. One popular approach was that of Pythagoras and his school, who said the eternal reality is mathematical. Ratios, numbers, proportions are the eternal, unchanging basis of the world. Plato generalized it to the idea of Platonic ideas or forms, eternal essences of things beyond space and time. And then a completely different answer was given by Democritus and the materialists, who said the eternal reality was matter. It was made of lots of little bits, the atoms, which moved around and permutated, and through their movements and permutations gave rise to the world we live in. These are all different models of eternity. The Platonic or Pythagorean one has had a huge influence. It was incorporated into Christian theology by St. Augustine, who could identify the eternal realm of forms or ideas with the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. There was a revival of Platonism at the Renaissance, and the founding fathers of modern science, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, were all essentially Pythagoreans or Platonists. They thought that the laws of nature were eternal. They were mathematical ideas in the mind of God. They were all Christians, and they all thought that God was a mathematician. It's an idea that always appeals to mathematicians and mathematical physicists. It means, of course, of all people, they're the ones that can most closely approach the divine nature. And so they thought that the so-called laws of nature, like Newton's law of gravitation, were eternal truths that were being discovered by human beings and were eternally there in the mind of God. These were not temporary models of reality, they were the truth. And that science, this was the basis of Enlightenment rationalism, science was uncovering the ultimate, ideal, absolute truths about nature, whereas religion was a matter of opinion and demagoguery and so forth. The scientific revolution happened against the background of the 30 Years' War, when Protestants and Catholics were killing each other. And for many of the early scientists and for many people since, this idea that you can rise above sectarian conflict to an absolute truth about nature, which is forever true, has been a very appealing idea. However, I think, as I hope to show, it's an illusion. In the 19th century, in the 17th century, there was a revival of atomism as well. And what mechanistic science essentially did was gave us a dual vision of reality, permanent atoms of matter and a permanent amount of motion or energy, governed by permanent laws of nature, ideas in the mind of a mathematical God. The laws were beyond space and time, they were non-material, but matter was material and was always the same in its quantity. This sameness in quantity was enshrined in the principles of conservation of matter and energy. The total amount of matter and energy is always the same. And the laws of nature, the idea of eternal laws of nature is simply taken for granted by most scientists. They haven't thought about it. It's just completely one of the givens of science. And it's, even if people don't think about it, it's built implicitly into the methods of science. The idea that any experiment should be repeatable anywhere at any time is because the laws of nature are believed to be the same at all times and in all places. So these are built-in, deep-seated assumptions. But the other great foundational idea of, that science has come into conflict with them is rooted in the Jewish part of our heritage. Among ancient people, the Jews were the only ones who saw history and as a developmental process, as a journey, as a movement in time. Other civilizations, the Greeks, the Hindus, the Buddhists, saw time as a series of cycles, endless cycles, of which human reincarnation was part. It was a cyclical view. The Jews had this very different view of time as a progressive movement towards an end or a goal. And the prototype, the model for this, was the journey of the people of Israel out of bondage in Egypt, through the wilderness and to the promised land, which it's a journey is the central metaphor. And that gives the idea of progress, moving towards a goal or an end. Originally, archetypally, this was a journey to the recovery of paradise, the land flowing with milk and honey. But of course, when they arrived in the promised land, then as now, it was full of Palestinians, and it led to nothing but trouble. And so the end of history was projected into the future, the coming of the Messiah, and then within Christianity to the second coming of Christ, the events of the apocalypse. So this idea that history was moving towards an end, a goal, or a culmination was built in to the Judeo-Christian model of time. In the 17th century, this idea was secularized, principally by Sir Francis Bacon here in England, who said that this promised land of prosperity and brotherhood and peace would be brought about not by divine intervention directly, but rather through man's God-given gifts of reason. Through what we now call science and technology, the world would be transformed to bring about prosperity and a land flowing with milk and honey. He was the great propagandist for science, and he equated science to the innocent knowledge of nature, which is embodied by Adam naming the animals before the fall. Scientists represented that recovery of an ancient and innocent knowledge of nature given to Adam before the fall. Good and evil and religion all came in at that stage, but science went back to this pre-lapsarian state of blissful and innocent knowledge. Wonderful propagandist move. I mean, he was Lord Chancellor of England, a very skilled arguer, and that he established the idea that science is morally neutral, and whereas religion has the business of dealing with ethics and so forth. Anyway, he also had this idea that through science and technology, the world would be transformed, and essentially gave us the idea of progress through science and technology. And that has become the ideology of every single government in the world. Everywhere in the world is now dominated by the idea of economic growth through science and technology. And it has indeed transformed the world. It was a vision which has been incredibly effective. No other ideology has ever conquered all of humanity, but this one has. It's essentially a derivative, a secularized derivative of the Judeo-Christian model of history. Other derivatives are Marxism, with the idea of a revolutionary change and an end to ordinary history, but these all grow out of this Judeo-Christian view of time. And by the end of the 18th century, this was the standard Enlightenment view. Science and reason represented the way forward and progress, whereas religion and superstition held humanity back and always looking to the past, whereas science was looking to the future. The kind of thing that I was converted to when I was at school, that we talked about last night. So at the end of the 18th century, it was only humanity that progressed. In the middle of the 19th century, with Darwin's theory of evolution, this progressive vision was extended to the whole of life. Now, the whole of life was seen as an evolutionary progress, a developmental process in time. That was a huge expansion of this developmental vision that came originally from the Judeo-Christian conception of faith and moving towards a goal in the future. But even after Darwin's theory of evolution, 1859, the physicists held firm to the idea of a universe that was eternal. In fact, according to them, it wasn't just eternal, it was running out of steam according to the second law of thermodynamics and would all finally come to freeze up in a final heat death. So that was the physics view. It wasn't until the 1920s that people began to question that. One of the first to do so was Father George Lemaitre, the Belgian Roman Catholic priest and cosmologist, who put forward the first vision of what we now call the Big Bang theory. He saw it as the hatching of the cosmic egg, an initial creation-like event, when the world began very small and has been growing ever since. At first he was ridiculed, but evidence for the expanding universe accumulated through the 20s and 30s. And finally, in 1964-65, the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation convinced cosmologists that the universe had indeed begun very small, less than the size of a head of a pin, that it's been growing ever since and cooling as it does so. And that is now the basis of our cosmology. It's an evolutionary cosmology. So finally, this evolutionary vision has taken over physics as well, through cosmology. Now, where does that leave the eternal laws of nature? Now, they were perfectly acceptable and unquestionable in an eternal universe. But we don't have an eternal universe anymore. As my friend Terence McKenna liked to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy in the universe from nowhere and all the laws that govern it in a single instant. Now, if you have troublesome materialistic friends who believe in the laws of nature, try asking them, where were the laws of nature before the Big Bang? Because if they're eternal, kind of Platonic laws, they must exist outside space and time, which is very metaphysical and unscientific, since it can't be proved. You can't prove the laws of nature were there before the universe. Or they all came into being at the moment of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code. But how do you know they were all there at the moment of the Big Bang? You can't possibly test that. In fact, the minute you think about it, you realize that the concept of laws of nature is a metaphor, like everything in science. It's a metaphor. It's based on human laws. And humans, not all humans have laws. Tribes have customs. And it was in the 17th century, it was explicit. God is the Lord of the universe. He makes the laws, these eternal mathematical laws. And because he's omnipotent, he acts as the universal law enforcement agency, making sure that everything obeys them, except perhaps humans. And so you have the idea of laws of nature. It's a political metaphor. But of course, if you follow through on this metaphor, the laws of England and the laws of everywhere else actually change with time. So why shouldn't the laws of nature evolve in an evolutionary universe? Well, a question to which no one has any answer. Why not? But I think it's better to switch from the law metaphor altogether. As C.S. Lewis once said, to say that a stone falls to earth because it's obeying a law makes it a man and even a citizen. that the law metaphor is an extremely unsatisfactory one for a science that claims that it's objective and not anthropomorphic and anthropocentric. It's deeply anthropocentric. A much better metaphor is habit. And what I'm suggesting essentially is that the so-called laws of nature are more like habits. The regularities of nature grow up as the universe evolves. They're not all fixed from the beginning. That means there's a kind of memory within nature. And that's the essence of the idea of morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is a theory to explain how the memory in nature might work. And it's based on the idea that similar patterns of activity resonate with subsequent similar patterns of activity across space and time. Everything in nature is rhythmic and a pattern of activity. All self-organizing systems are patterns of activity: atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies of organisms, ecosystems, planetary systems, galaxies. They're all patterns of activity with rhythms and vibratory patterns within them. What I'm suggesting is that there's a resonance across time between similar patterns, which gives a kind of collective memory within each species. A baby giraffe embryo knows how to develop into a giraffe because it resonates with previous giraffes across space and time, and there's a kind of collective memory of form. All plants have this collective memory as well, and so do crystals. Now, this gives a very different way of thinking about nature, and it turns out to be testable scientifically. For example, if you make a new kind of chemical that's never existed before and crystallize it, there won't be a pattern of activity for those crystals because they've never existed before. I call these patterns of activity morphic fields, from the Greek word morphe, meaning form. They're fields of form which have a kind of memory built into them. This means if you make a new chemical and crystallize it, it may take quite a while for the crystals to appear. You have to wait for a new form to appear in the world. Once they've appeared, the next time you make the compound, it could be anywhere else in the world, they should appear a bit easier. The third time, a bit easier still because of morphic resonance from the first and the second crystals. The fourth time, easier still because of resonance from the first, second, and third lot of crystals. Compounds should get easier to crystallize all over the world the more often they're crystallized. Is this true? Well, yes. When I first thought of this, I was shy to ask my chemist friends, but I finally plucked up the courage, and I said, is it true that things get easier to crystallize as time goes on? They said, yes, everyone knows that. And my main informant was a fellow of Clare College in Cambridge, so he immediately added, but it's not because of morphic resonance. So I said, well, what is it then? He said, oh, well, he said, we know perfectly well in chemistry how it happens. There's lots of stories about chemists carrying fragments of crystals from lab to lab on their beards. And these fragments of the previous crystals nucleate crystallization processes. I said, do you take this seriously? He said, of course, everyone's heard these stories. It turned out the whole of this is based on a kind of folkloric a strand of chemistry that's communicated informally to students of the subject. But I didn't believe they could possibly take it seriously. But when I first published an account of morphic resonance in New Scientist, a couple of weeks later there was an angry letter from the professor of chemical engineering at Cambridge saying it was ridiculous to think there was any problem about explaining this. Hadn't I ever heard of Perkins, the great chemist, whose beard harbored nuclei for almost all known crystallization processes? I couldn't believe it. This letter was written not as a joke, but in anger. And if there haven't been any migrant chemists, it's assumed that in microscopic particles of crystals have been wafted around the air in the atmosphere as invisible dust. So that's the state of the art in chemistry in explaining this phenomenon. And of course, it would be easy to test this experimentally. There are other tests in the realm of chemical melting points, which I discuss in the new edition of my book, A New Science of Life, there's also evidence from melting points that this is happening. It should apply to biological development. If organisms develop abnormally, it should be easier for others to develop with the same abnormality. And a long series of experiments with fruit flies, again described in my book, shows that this is the case. It should happen in the realm of behavior. If rats are trained to learn a new trick in Bournemouth, then rats all over the world should be able to learn it quicker just because the rats have learned it here. And the more that learn it, the easier it should get elsewhere. Again, there's evidence from long series of experiments in laboratories that rats do in fact learn quicker after other rats have learned the same thing. There's a big effect. I mean, the rate of learning increased tenfold in these experiments. We're not talking about tiny marginal alterations. Again, this evidence is in my books, A New Science of Life in the Presence of the Past. So rat learning, it should apply to human beings as well. It should be getting easier to learn what others have learned just because they've learned it. One prediction, and it does seem to be getting easier to do computer programming, windsurfing, snowboarding, all these kinds of things. But of course other variables come into play, educational videos, better designs of equipment, improved teaching methods, and so forth. To test morphic resonance, you need to look at something which has remained much the same over a long period of time. In the 1980s, I realized that IQ tests would be ideal from this point of view, because the same kinds of tests have been given for many, many years, since about 1918. I predicted that average scores on intelligence tests should be going up, not because people on average are becoming more intelligent, but because the tests on average are becoming easier to do. I couldn't get the evidence, I couldn't find it, but in the late 80s it was discovered that exactly this has been going on. It was first discovered with Japanese and then with American IQ test scores. It's now been found all over the world. Average scores have gone up by about 30% during the course of the 20th century. But there's no other evidence that people are 30% more intelligent. And this was discovered by a psychologist called James Flynn. It's now called the Flynn effect, this rising IQ. And I think it's evidence for morphic resonance. Attempts to explain it by conventional means have all failed. People have tried to explain it in terms of improved exposure to tests, higher nutrition, more protein content, and so forth. But none of these can explain more than a tiny part of the Flynn effect. There are many other tests that can be done for morphic resonance in the human realm, and many have been done. There have been about 30 different experiments so far, and most of them give evidence that something like this is really happening. I summarize all the latest research in the new edition of A New Science of Life, which came out last year, and is the only summary, really, of this body of evidence. It gives rise to many ideas for new experiments. One was thought up by my older son when he was taking his GCSEs a few years ago. He came to me one day and said, I and my friends, he said, have thought of a way of getting extra marks in GCSE exams without doing extra work. And I said, well, that sounds good. How's that going to happen? And he said, by morphic resonance. And I said, so I said, well, how are you going to do that? And he said, well, for example, in the physics and maths papers, there are 15 questions. He said, we're going to do questions 14 and 15 first, then go back to questions 1, 2, 3, and for most of the questions we'll be about 10 minutes behind everyone else in England, and we'll get a boost by morphic resonance. So I said, well, some of your friends must have been morphic resonance skeptics. And he said, well, yes, they were. He said, but we worked out that they said, what if morphic resonance doesn't really exist? He said, we worked out if morphic resonance doesn't really exist, we wouldn't lose anything. But if it does, we'd gain something. So they all actually did this. This was a brilliant idea, really, for testing morphic resonance. It so happens the head of the Oxford, Cambridge, and Royal Society of Arts Examination Board in Science was an old friend of mine from Cambridge. So I said to him, look, I said, if you just change the order of questions in a random subsample of papers and see if people do better if they do answer them later than other people, this would be a fantastic test of morphic resonance. And it wouldn't cost anything just changing the order of the questions. He was really excited for a few days, and then he rang me up and said, Rupert, he said, look, he said, I'm due to retire in a few years. He said, I want to have a full pension. And he said, if I turn our national science examination into a morphic resonance test, he said, that's not going to happen. So he said, sorry, I just can't do it. Anyway, it's a good idea, and it could be done, and perhaps one day it will be done. But I say this to show that testing this seemingly outrageous theory is remarkably easy in some cases. One can think of simple, potentially effective tests. there's already considerable circumstantial evidence that this actually happens. Now, this leads to a completely different view of biological inheritance. At the moment, for most people, the word heredity and genetics are treated as synonyms. The materialist theory of inheritance has to be inheritance is material, because for materialists everything is material. So inheritance has to be accounted for by material components of the fertilized egg, which are now identified as the genes. Now, I've thought for a long time that genes are grossly overrated, because I don't think they can possibly account for all the inherited information in animals and plants, the instincts of cuckoos that enable them to fly to South Africa without their parents. Baby cuckoos never meet their parents, being cuckoos. And yet they fly independently of their parents to the right place in South Africa. It's an instinct, but how is that inherited? What DNA actually does is codes for the sequence of amino acids in protein molecules. We know that's what it does. It's one of the great triumphs of molecular biology. But there's a huge gulf between making the right proteins and flying to the right part of South Africa, or a baby spider knowing how to spin a web the right way just by having the right proteins. It's like saying all you need to have is the right building materials delivered to a building site, and the building will just erect itself. It doesn't work like that. And so it can't conceivably work like that. And yet people have been brainwashed into believing that all heredity is in the genes and it's all genetically programmed, or they contain a blueprint for the organism. They don't. They just contain protein. They just code for proteins. And some of them code for the control of protein synthesis. I've always thought that the Genome Project was vastly overhyped, the Human Genome Project. In the 80s and 90s, people said, if we can sequence the human genome and know every base pair of every DNA molecule in the genome, we'll understand human nature. Billions of dollars were spent on this. But when the human genome sequence was finally published, it was a big disappointment. First of all, it turns out that we only have about 25,000 genes, whereas people had been expecting at least 100,000. Fruit flies have 24,000, sea urchins 28,000, rice plants 35,000. We have a rather unimpressive genome in terms of sheer numbers. We're 99% identical to the chimpanzees, and yet we're obviously different from them. So this itself was a big problem, and the companies that had hoped to make billions of dollars out of patenting human genes instead lost billions of dollars. The head of the private genome project, Craig Venter, head of Celery Genomics, that sequenced the genome and hoped to patent genes and then own them, their share price collapsed from about $60 a share to about 11 cents soon after the genome was sequenced, because it became clear this just wasn't going to make money. Craig Venter at least has a sense of humor, and when interviewed after this said, I'm a guy who's made a million the hard way by working my way down from a billion. He's now head of the Synthetic Life Corporation. He wants to be the first man to create life. So this man is irrepressible. Anyway, it's turned out to be a damp squib. And I had a wager to try and focus attention on this last year with one of my old sparring partners, Professor Lewis Walpert. He published a prediction at the beginning of last year saying it will soon be possible, given the genome of a fertilized human egg, to predict every detail of the ensuing baby, including abnormalities. And I thought this was showed such a faith in the genome. I took him up on it. We had a debate at the Cambridge Science Festival last year on the nature of life. And it became very clear to me that he just couldn't hear arguments against his point of view. So in the discussion, I said to him, the trouble with you, Lewis, is that you're such a man of faith. He said, I'm not a man of faith, I'm an atheist. And I said, yes, but you complete believer in the predictive power of the genome and the mechanistic agenda. I said, you can't explain the nature of life, you've just admitted it. You can't predict anything on the basis of the genome, or at least nothing very impressive, and you've just admitted that. But you believe so firmly that you will be able to do so, that your faith is such that you think that your beliefs will turn into facts at some stage in the future. It's what Sir Karl Popper called promissory materialism. Materialism is based on issuing promissory notes against future explanations, which don't yet exist. explanations for inheritance, the nature of the mind, and so forth. So I challenged him to a bet. I said, okay, I bet you this isn't going to happen in 10 years. He said, well, maybe not 10 years, perhaps 20. I said, all right, I bet it's in 20 years. Well, no, it may take a bit longer than... I said, well, how long then? He said, well, 100. Let's say 100. And I said, look, Lewis, that's a very meaningless time. We'll both be dead and gone. And, and then your successors could just say, well, give us another 100. So afterwards, it ended inconclusively because I couldn't pin him down. But afterwards, I rang him up and I said, let's turn this into a proper wager. And he's a good sport. He agreed. He said, well, it can't be humans. And I said, it's got to be 20 years. It can't be longer. So he said, all right, then the mouse. And I said, all right. So I drafted the statement. Within 20 years, his statement. We will, given the genome of a fertilized mouse egg, we will be able to predict every detail of the ensuing organism. So I sent it to him. He said, agreed. And we agreed on the stake. We consulted David Lorimer and others about what would be the best thing that would go up in value over 20 years. Money obviously wouldn't. And the answer in the end turned out to be fine port. So Walpert and I both paid for half a case each. So together, a whole case of Quinto de Vesuvio 2005, which the experts say will be drinking perfectly by 2029 when this wager terminates. And I asked Martin Rees, the president of the Royal Society, if they'd evaluate it if necessary. And he said, well, I can't promise for my successor, but let's say you'll ask the Royal Society to adjudicate if there's any dispute. So I thought it was all agreed. And then Walpert emailed me back and said, well, it can't be a mouse. It's too complicated. It's got to be a chick. So I said, all right, let's say a mouse or a chick. And he said, agreed. And a week later, he said, a chick's too complicated. I'm afraid it's going to have to be a frog. And so I said, all right, a mouse, a chick, or a frog. And so then after another week, he emailed me again. And he said even a frog would be too complicated. It's going to have to be a nematode worm. And this is a particular worm that's used in labs. It's a millimeter long. It's a small worm. And I said, well, this is a big climb down from humans to the millimeter long nematode worm. Anyway, I said, well, look, why don't we just say any animal or plant? It would include worms and plants, if you like. And so he agreed to that. We published our wager in New Scientist. The case of port is in the cellars of the Wine Society, who are storing it free for the next 20 years. And the interesting thing is that when this got on the internet, there was a lot of discussion. Most scientists think I'm going to win. Even Walpert, I saw him at a function at the Royal Society a few weeks ago, and he came up to me, he said, Rupert, he said, I've been thinking about it, I think you're going to win. So that's, I think even Walpert is backing down on this triumphalism of genetic determinism. One reason is that in the last 2 or 3 years, people have been correlating the genomes of 30,000 different people, trying to work out which genes code for what. These are called genome-wide association studies. And they've looked at genes for height, for example. We know that 90% of the inheritability of height, height is 90% heritable. That means you can predict a child's ultimate height with a 90% accuracy if you know the height of the parents. Now, they looked at genes for height and found there were about 30 genes that influenced height. They then tried to predict people's height on the basis of the genes, and they found they could only predict about 5% of the variation in height, compared with the 90% that we know is heritable. And this missing 85% of heritability is now called the missing heritability problem. And it turns out the genes just don't explain what they're supposed to explain. Professor Steve Jones of University College London thinks that spending billions more on this genome research is, as he put it, throwing good money after bad. Billions have been spent, literally billions, hundreds of billions, on this genome project, the human and other animal project, of public and private money. And there's extremely little to show for it. It's just got bogged down in appalling problems like the missing heritability problem. The whole thing's coming unraveled. The biotech industry has lost hundreds of billions of dollars. Most investments have paid off nothing. The companies have just faded away. There's a crisis in the heart of molecular biology in that it's now becoming clear that genes don't explain all inheritance. And that's because I think most of it depends on morphic resonance. The genes enable us to inherit proteins, but the shape of the body, the instincts and so forth, depend on morphic resonance. Morphic resonance depends on similarity, and the most similar organisms to each other are, of course, identical twins in the human realm. On the basis of morphic resonance, one would expect that twins separated soon after birth would have extremely parallel lives because they'd resonate with each other, even if they don't see each other or meet each other. It's known that identical twins often have extraordinarily similar lives, even if they're raised in separate families, they're adopted by different families. Twin studies have shown enormous evidence for these similarities. This is usually interpreted as saying, oh, well, that just proves it's all in the genes. So if it's nature or nurture, environment or heredity, the fact they're so similar is taken to prove that it's all in the genes. And the vast edifices of modern speculation in sociobiology and selfish gene theory rest on the foundations of these twin studies. However, morphic resonance provides a much more reasonable explanation of these similarities, and I don't think they prove genetic determinism at all. So this is one of the big assumptions of our time, genetic determinism, and I think that it's based on foundations of sand. Now, when you ask the question, who in the past was most similar to me, then the answer has to be you yourself. We're all most similar to ourselves in the past than we are to anybody else. And therefore, the most specific morphic resonance working upon us from the past will be from ourselves. And I think it's this resonance from ourselves in the past which helps maintain the forms of our bodies, despite turnover of cells and proteins and so forth. And I think it also underlies our memories, our ordinary memories, like remembering where we live or what we did yesterday and that kind of thing. I don't think it's in the brain. Now, we've all been brought up with the idea of memories in the brain. It's a materialist assumption. The mind is the brain, memory is in the mind, therefore it must be in the brain, there must be memory traces. It's an unquestioned assumption within science. And for 100 years, people have tried desperately hard to find memories in the brain. And again, the memories have eluded them. Over and over again, people have thought they've identified the memories, and then they cut out that bit of brain, and the memories are lost for a while, but then they come back. It's been done with rats, with monkeys, with octopuses. As one researcher said, memory seems to be both everywhere and nowhere in particular within the brain, because they can't pin it down. One person who tried to explain this was Carl Pribram, a neuroscientist who's had the idea that memory is stored holographically over large areas of the brain. The old idea that you could find, like connections in a telephone exchange, links and changes in synapses, just simply hasn't turned out to be true. And I think the reason people have failed to find memories in the brain is the same reason that I wouldn't be able to find traces in your television set of the programs you watched yesterday. They're not stored in the wires or transistors. I think the brain's more like a TV receiver that tunes into memories rather than a video recorder. Now, of course, damage to the brain can lead to loss of memory, as in strokes or Alzheimer's disease, degeneration of the brain, and so forth. That doesn't prove the memory is all stored in it. If I come to your home and clip out a few wires from the sound circuitry of your TV set, I could make your TV aphasic. It wouldn't produce any sounds. But that wouldn't prove all those sounds are stored or originate in that part of the set. It would simply prove it's necessary for their reception. And I think the same is true of the brain. I think we tune into our memories rather than have them stored inside the brain. Now, this is one of the areas where there's an immediate consequence for any religious view. One of the reasons materialists like the idea that memories are stored in the brain is it provides a simple two-step argument that refutes all religious beliefs in survival at one stroke. When I was a materialist and atheist myself, I enjoyed this kind of argument because one could confound people so easily. If you say, where are memories stored? And everyone says, in the brain. You say, what happens to the brain at death? Well, it decays. So what happens to memories? Well, they must decay too. But then every theory of survival in every religion requires the persistence of memories. If you believe in a last judgment, that you go to sleep and then appear at the last judgment before your maker to give an accounting of yourself, if you've forgotten who you are and what you've done, it wouldn't be a very meaningful experience. And if you believe in reincarnation in one form or another, that has to depend on some carryover, at least of unconscious tendencies or patterns. some kind of memory. All theories of purgatory, ongoing development in a kind of purgatory type state, a theory I like myself, and that requires memory. It wouldn't be meaningful without. So the fact that memories, I think, are not stored in the brain leaves open the possibility they're not eliminated at death. They potentially persist, but then there's a question of how would you tune into them. That's a big problem. I'm not saying this solves the problem of survival, but the conventional theory leaves the question closed, whereas this leaves it open. And it's one of the areas where science has the interface between science and religion, as Dawkins rightly points out, isn't just a matter of different levels of discourse, etc. There are real conflicts, and memory in the brain is one of them. The morphic resonance also has many implications for religious practices, like rituals. The whole point of rituals, which occur in every culture and every civilization in the world, is that they reenact a story of origins, usually. And they're what enable members of a group to be incorporated into the group and linked to all those who've been before, because every social group includes the ancestors as well as the present members. So, for example, the Jewish Passover feast is a ritual reenactment of that crucial event in Jewish history, when just before they left bondage in Egypt and left to go towards the Promised Land. So they reenact that and tell the story. And you have to reenact it the right way, the same way it's been done before. Holy Communion is a reenactment of the Last Supper of Jesus with his disciples, itself a Passover meal. The American Thanksgiving dinner is a national ritual. By taking part, Americans, by eating the right food, turkey, and saying the right kinds of things, are made Americans and incorporated with all those who've done it before back to the first settlers in the New World. Now, from a rationalist point of view, the conservatism of rituals, the use of traditional languages like Old Slavic in the Russian Church, Sanskrit in Hindu rituals, and so forth, is meaningless mumbo-jumbo. But from a morphic resonance point of view, that very similarity creates the conditions for resonance whereby those who take part in the ritual resonate with those who've done it before. There is a real presence of the past through these ritual acts. Well, morphic fields underlie the organization of animals and plants. They help to explain regeneration. When an animal or plant is damaged and can regenerate, it's because the field remains a whole. Fields are intrinsically holistic. They can't be split into bits. This is true of magnetic fields, for example. If you have a magnet and you cut the North Pole off the magnet, you don't get an isolated North Pole. You get a little magnet with a North and a South Pole, and the other magnet has a North and a South Pole. The field is within and around the magnet, and it's indivisible. It's a whole, it's by its very nature. I think that morphogenetic fields, the form-shaping fields of plants and animals, are similarly wholes. If you take cuttings from a willow tree, you can take hundreds of cuttings from a tree. Each cutting can grow new roots and new shoots and grow into a whole new tree. And that's, I think, just like a magnet, because each of those fragments contains a whole willow field. You're not separating a part of it. This helps to explain regeneration. Also, I think, helps to explain phantom limbs in amputees. I think what the amputee is feeling is not an illusion produced in the brain, because I think brains are overrated, like genes are. And I think they're feeling the field of the missing limb, which is actually there. In newts, limbs can regenerate. In frogs and most higher animals, they can't. But I think the field is still there. Something's blocking the regeneration. I don't know what. But I think these are field phenomena. Now, I want to just move on quickly to talk about one other area of research, which is to do with telepathy. Social groups have fields. A flock of birds are a bit like iron filings in a magnetic field. They can turn without bumping into each other much quicker than they could do by just looking at their neighbors. It happens too fast to explain it in terms of just sensory information from the neighbors. And they're now modeled on computers as field phenomena. I think they are field phenomena. I think the whole social group has a field. I think social groups in general have fields. Members of the group are linked through this field. If members of the group separate, for example, if wolves go off to hunting and leave the cubs in the den, which they usually do, then the field stretches. It continues to connect them even over hundreds of miles. And that field connection between members of the group enables information to pass. And that, I think, is the basis of telepathy. I think it's a normal means of communication among separated members of animal groups. The closest physical analogy is quantum entanglement or quantum non-locality, when two particles that have been part of the same system, when they move apart, remain linked to each other at a distance, and a change in one instantly affects the other. This is now being applied in quantum computing and quantum cryptography. It's this weird aspect of quantum theory is a well-established experimental fact. And it's not distance dependent, like telepathy isn't either. So that's the closest physical analogy, and like telepathy, it doesn't fall off with distance. So I think this is common among animals, and because of that, I did most of my research on this subject with domestic animals, which are the ones we know best. I spent years working on dogs and cats and other domestic animals, research summarized in my book, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and Other Unexplained Powers of Animals. I started by asking people about their own experiences. I now have a database of more than 5,000 cases. And I found that all over the world, people told me the same kinds of stories, and it's a kind of natural history that emerges from this. For example, many cat owners say that their cat picks up their intentions and knows when they're planning to take it to the vet. The cat disappears. And after it's happened several times, they try and avoid thinking of the vet, letting the cat see the carrying basket and stuff, but the cat still knows. And some people, in despair, have taken to ringing the vet from work so the cat can't overhear the conversation. And then they swing by home after work to pick up the cat, but it's still not there. So we heard so many of these stories that we rang up all the, I and my assistants rang up all the vets in the North London Yellow Pages, 65 clinics, and said, did they ever have a problem with people missing appointments? And they said, oh, it happens all the time with cats. People are always ringing up to say they can't find the cat. And the only exception was a clinic that said, oh, well, it happens so often we've given up an appointment system for cats. People just have to arrive with their animals. That's one area. Another is dogs and cats that know when their owners are coming home. That many dogs and cats wait at a door or window, sometimes 10 minutes or more before the person comes home. This is something that I've done a lot of research on. We do experiments where we film the place the dog waits. We have the time code on the film. We film it the whole time the person is out. We get people to come home at random times, not routine times. We communicate the random times through a telephone pager. No one at home knows when they're coming. They don't know when they're going to come home in advance. To avoid familiar car sounds, they travel by taxi. And in experiments that we've done over and over again, hundreds of videotaped trials with 2 dogs, but with some trials with an even larger number. All this is published in scientific journals. Over and over again, they go and wait at the door. And the most sensitive dogs start waiting when the person forms the intention to come home before they've even got into the taxi. And this has been challenged by skeptics and replicated unwittingly by skeptics too. And I describe all this in my book with all the details. I don't have time to go into the experiments, but we've got some beautiful videos of this. And this is a very common pattern. There's millions of dogs in Britain doing this on a regular basis. Cats do it too. Fewer cats do it than dogs, not necessarily because they're less sensitive, but some of them I think are just less interested. In the human realm, telepathy follows the same principles. It depends on close bonds. And one of the areas I've investigated it, previously uninvestigated, is between mothers and babies. Many mothers believe they have a telepathic bond with their baby, and many nursing mothers report that when they're breastfeeding, as soon as they go back to work or start leaving the baby for a while, they of course leave it not at a regular feeding time. Many of them have had the experience of feeling their milk let down when they're away from the baby. Probably several women here have had that experience. And most women just assume that means their baby needs them. In the past, they just went home. Now they ring home on a mobile telephone. But I did a detailed study with 20 nursing mothers in North London and found that they were indeed right most of the time. And it wasn't a matter of routine patterns. That there really does seem to be this telepathic link between mothers and babies. Interestingly, the telepathic link doesn't work through the mind primarily, it works through the body. These things work at the emotional level. Telepathy means distant feeling. Tele as in telephone, distant pathy as in empathy, sympathy, feeling. It's not primarily about thought transference or the communication of large amounts of information. It's mostly about feelings like needs. And the commonest kind in the modern world by far is telephone telepathy. You think of somebody, then they ring, and you say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you. Surveys show that about 80% of the population have had that experience. How many people here have had that with phones? Well, here it's closer to 95%. But this is something that's extremely common. And so what's going on? Well, the standard scientific response to this, the armchair skeptic, says, some of you have all heard this, I'm sure, they say, oh, well, you think about other people all the time, and then when someone rings you up, you imagine it's telepathy, but that's just an illusion. You just forget the millions of times you're wrong. So it's all right as a hypothesis, but you know, in science, it's not enough to have a hypothesis. You need evidence. So where's the evidence? Nobody had ever investigated this, so there is no evidence, or at least till recently was no evidence on this subject. I developed a simple experiment, which I've now done quite extensively. You can see a clip showing one of these experiments on YouTube, on my website. How they work is that if you're the subject, you name 4 people you might be telepathic with, people you know well, friends or family members. You then sit at home in front of a landline telephone with no caller ID display, being videotaped. We pick one of the 4 people at random by the throw of a die or with a random number table, ring them up and ask them to call you. The phone rings. You know it's one of these 4 people. They've been picked at random, so you can't tell through knowledge of their patterns of daily life or anything. Before you pick it up, you have to guess who it is. I think it's John. You pick it up, hello, John. You're right or you're wrong. There's 25%, 1 in 4 chance of being right by pure guesswork. In these tests, the actual success rate was 45%, way above chance, highly significant, hundreds of tests. This has been replicated in 2 universities, Freiburg and Amsterdam. It's been replicated in an experiment done for television with the Nolan sisters, a 1980s girl band. That's the one you can see on YouTube. It's a 5-minute clip showing this experiment. And I now have this operating in an automated test. It works off my website at the online experiments portal. You register online. You give the names of 3, in this case, 3 people you know well and their mobile telephone numbers. And this test works automatically. The computer picks one of the 3 people, sends them a text message, asking them to ring you at a number it gives on the text message. It's a landline number. They ring that number. A voice says, welcome to the telepathy test. Please wait while we contact the subject of the test. They then hear music specially composed by one of my sons. And then, meanwhile, the computer rings up the subject, and the mobile phone says, telephone telepathy test. And the voice then says, this is the telephone telepathy test. One of your 3 callers is on the line right now waiting to speak to you. Please guess who it is by pressing 1, 2, or 3. And they guess. And as soon as they've guessed, the line opens up, and then they get to speak with the person. They get instant feedback. After a minute, it cuts off because I'm paying for the call. Then after a random time delay, it does it again. And after 6 trials, the test's over. Everyone gets a text message telling them, thanks for taking part. And the score was 3 out of 6 or whatever. The chance hit rate here is 33%. The actual hit rate in more than 2,000 trials is 44%. It's quite a big effect. It's not as big as my other experiments, because in this one, people take part who are just not very sensitive anyway. Anyone can take part. But this is a simple way of doing the test, and as I mentioned last night, various mobile telephone companies are interested in this kind of research now, and it could go mainstream quite fast. I don't have time to speak except to mention the final point, which is the idea that our minds are not inside our brains spatially. They're like fields that stretch out beyond brains, just like magnets have fields beyond the magnet. The mobile phone has a field beyond the phone. So our minds are fields that stretch out beyond our brains. They may be rooted in our brains normally, but they stretch out beyond them. Like when you see me standing here now, my suggestion is that the image you're forming of me is located right here. It's in your mind, but it's not in your brain. That vision involves a two-way process. Light comes in, changes happen in the brain, and then images are projected out. Our entire perceptual world is outside us where it seems to be. The official view is it's all inside your head. The standard view is that your mind's in the brain, and when you see me here, there's somewhere inside your head, there's a little Rupert standing there, and you falsely imagine that I'm actually, that your image is located outside your brain. According to the official view, when you look at the sky you see is inside your brain, and your skull must therefore be beyond the sky. It's not a very coherent view, and yet virtually everybody in our society takes it for granted without question. No evidence for it. No one's ever seen images inside heads. I think that our images are all outside our heads. It's an old theory of vision. Plato had it. Traditional people everywhere have it. Children under the age of 10 think of vision in this way. But sophisticated grown-up people are supposed to believe it's all in the head, even though they've got no evidence for it. I think the mind is extended through attention and intention all the time. One piece of evidence for the sense of the extension of vision is the sense of being stared at. I've done a lot of research on that. If you look at other people, if something projects out when you look at things, you should be able to affect things or people just by looking at them, even if they don't know you're there. This seems to be true. Most people have had the sensation of being looked at from behind or making others turn around. I've done lots of experiments on this. They're so simple a child can do them, and thousands of children already have done them in primary schools and lots of students in universities. The evidence is now immense that this is a real phenomenon, and of course most people believe it anyway because they've experienced it. So I would say then that our mind is extended far beyond our brain, both in time, through memory, through intentions into the future, and spatially through every perception. Every act of attention involves the stretching out of our minds. In fact, attention means that. Ad tendere, to stretch towards. Intention, intendere, to stretch into. Our minds stretch out beyond our brains in our acts of perception. We're far more permeable to each other, both through memory and through these intentions, than most people usually assume. Our memories are not inside our brains. Our brains are more like tuning systems. Our bodies are more like tuning systems. Heredity is not all in the genes. The laws of nature are not all fixed. They're more like habits. There's a kind of memory in nature, and these habits evolve, and they're no doubt subject to natural selection. So it's a much more radically evolutionary picture than the conventional one, which stops short of physics, although now cosmology is not the bottom out of the conventional picture. So I think that the view of nature that this leads to is a very different one from the one we're used to, and yet I think it's more scientific, a lot less scientific. And I also think it's one that's much more compatible with most of the tenets of faith and the practice of faith than the materialistic worldview, which is long past its sell-by date, in my opinion. So I think that these kinds of changes are likely to happen in science. I've been thinking they're about to happen for years. They happen slower than I've often hoped, but I think they will happen. I think that they're almost inevitable because the official worldview is getting unraveling faster and faster at the moment. So, thank you.
Mine's not so much a question as a comment.
Yes.
My son, who's 43, was in London recently. Is it too near? Can you hear me now? That's better. And I was sitting indoors, in my kitchen, and the phone rang. I'd just been sitting writing out a cheque, and he phoned up and he said, "I can see you sitting in the kitchen writing out a cheque." So that's a sort of an example of what you were just saying.
Yes.
And he often does that. It's as if he's watching me Yes. It's rather scary.
Well, I think it is interesting you see that it's with your son, because these things happen, they actually happen a lot between mothers and their children, especially mothers and daughters. That's the most common combination for telephone telepathy. But this is really an important part of the natural history of telepathy. And oddly enough, parapsychologists have, partly because parapsychology started in the 30s in the era of behaviorism, they've done a lot of experiments where people look at meaningless cards with total strangers. You could hardly think of something less likely to reveal telepathy. It's rather a wonder those experiments show any effect at all, but they do. But it's a small effect. Telepathy typically occurs when there's an emotional bond between the people, and often when there's a need. Making a call to someone, a telephone call, is you want to talk to them, you have a need to talk to them, you have an intention to talk to them, and that's what they pick up. That's why they start thinking about you, I think.
Could I don't want to be greedy, but could I just ask one other question? I've noticed that a lot of people look like they're animals.
Yes. I don't know to what degree one can... I tried to quantify that myself. I went to Crufts dog show with my sons when they were quite small. And I said to them, people look by this. We stood near the exit at the end of the show and watched people leaving with their animals. And there were a few striking examples, but not that many, but there were some, certainly.
Lady.
I'm interested about cats and dogs who go to sit with somebody who's dying, even though the person is not their owner.
Yes.
I believe there's a cat in the hospital who...
Yes, there's one
if
widely
the cat
reported
comes
cat.
and sits on your bed, you know your number's up.
That's right. That's right. There's this report of this cat called Oscar that does that. In my book, I have a chapter called Animals That Comfort and Heal. And it's actually quite common for dogs or cats to pick up when someone's distressed and go and sit with them. My wife had a cat that she called Remedy, precisely because the cat did this and acted as a kind of remedy whenever she was feeling depressed or ill or something. And it's actually, I've documented before this cat rocketed to stardom, Oscar, in all the papers recently. There have been quite a few cases of that, of pets in hospices who do that. In that case, they're not doing it with people they've known for a long time. They seem to pick up when the person needs.
So what's the field that they're tapping into a field that is not the field of the owner, the personal field.
Yes,
so
they're tapping into a field, but they do, after all, live in these hospices or spend most of their time there. So they, I think, treat the people in the hospices, as it were, as members of the family.
Yes, I'm thinking of a situation, though, where a dog unknown to my family, visiting our house for the first time, came and sat close to my husband, who was dying. And wouldn't leave him alone, you know. And I said,
Yes.
I think that dog knows.
Well, I think animals can pick up emotions and feelings and needs. And, of course, they can pick up fear very easily and general emotions. So I think they're very finely tuned to emotions. And, of course, in their own world, emotional intelligence is the key. They're all dogs, after all, like wolves.
The field of emotion.
Yes, yes.
I understand.
Yes.
This is a story, not a question. At this conference a year ago, I was talking about Only Connect. And following my talk, I mentioned an experience I'd had with a very old friend of mine who has Alzheimer's. And I said that, much to my surprise, my mobile phone in my handbag suddenly started to ring. Now, I don't actually use this, almost never, and I couldn't tell you my mobile phone number myself. But I picked it up, and it was this friend of mine. And she said, who am I speaking to? And I said, it's Jenny. You know me. And we had a chat for a while. But she was fairly spaced out, as I've got used to her being. Then I had a long chat with her husband, put the phone down, and I thought, how is this? Why has this happened that my friend with Alzheimer's has managed to phone me on my mobile phone?
Yes. Very odd. Did you try and find out by asking
The
her?
gentleman.
No.
Yeah.
It's reassuring
Mm.
that there are other aspects
Mm. Yes.
below the surface level.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, just a comment, Rupert.
Yes.
We're all after research grants, and it's vital that this field gets research funding. There's a simple application of this from Alzheimer's. You could invent a treatment technique that involved morphic resonance, getting Alzheimer's patients to look at photographs, video recordings from their youth, trying to tune into parts of the identity from the past. I mean, if you made a success of it, people try to explain through observational learning and so
Yes.
on, but the point is it would nevertheless make a great impact and give us some research funding. Yeah.
Well, that's maybe a good idea. I've never worked with clinical cases at all, so I wouldn't be the person to do that. I mean, my own research with people has mostly been with healthy people, and I don't have a medical background, so.
Yeah.
But I'm sure these things could be applied.
Okay, I'll try and
Both
get
to
funding this way.
And also in the educational sphere, morphic resonance could make educational methods more effective.
If you take the fundamental physical laws, such as Kepler's laws about orbitary motion or acceleration due to gravity, do you see any changes in around the edges of those, as it were, so that they become less 100% and more subject to the probability?
Well, there's two ways of looking at that. One is that the Newton's laws of gravity, even in classical physics, as Laplace found, you can't really solve the three-body problem. So if you have one body like the Earth and the Sun, you can calculate what happens there. As soon as you introduce a third body, they're all moving, they're all attracting each other. It becomes mathematically almost impossible. And when you've got all the planets in the solar system, you cannot actually solve it using classical or Einsteinian relativity. What you can do is produce approximate solutions, which until fairly recently people thought that these were, as good, it was deterministic. We now know that the solar system, the set piece of celestial mechanics, is in fact chaotic in its motions. It's subject, you can only model it in the long term using chaotic dynamics. It's a many-body problem which it can't be solved exactly, but it turns out that there's perturbations that don't lead to exact repetitions. So that's one level, that even the set piece of celestial mechanics turns out not to be a set piece of mechanics at all. And secondly, the question of does the gravitational constant vary, for example? This is something I examined in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World. I have a chapter on how constant are the fundamental constants. If you actually look at the data on the gravitational constant, it varies quite a lot. The current accepted value is about 6.72, but it's been between 6.6 and 6.79, even in the last 10 years. Even 1% variations in something, most people assume this is fixed to many places of decimals. It isn't. It fluctuates wildly. And the only reason that the wild fluctuations can be contained is that how they do it is they take these values from different labs and they just average them. And every few years they publish the latest best figure for the gravitational constant. If you look at the actual data, there's a wide spread. I went to discuss it with the head of metrology at the National Physics Laboratory, and he admitted the constants vary and that the speed of light dropped by 20 kilometers per second between 1928 and 1945 all over the world. And he said, this is one of the more embarrassing episodes in the history of our subject. We prefer not to talk about it. But I mean, I worked this out. I ferreted out the information. But he didn't deny it or anything. But anyway, just as I was leaving, he said, well, look, these have just arrived from the press. You may want to have this. And he handed me this pamphlet. He said, the latest value of the physical constants. And so they get updated from time to time, but they assume that all previous values are just experimental errors. I think the gravitational constant may be fluctuating. And Whitehead, the Alfred North Whitehead, who produced a cosmology similar to Einstein's, predicted the value would fluctuate depending on our position relative to other stars in the galaxy. So there may even be an orthodox explanation for fluctuations in the measured constant g. And now as you know, physicists have discovered, as it were, the cosmic unconscious with all this dark matter and dark energy. 96% of reality is utterly obscure by definition. And we don't know where it is or what it does. So we could be passing through clouds of it which would affect measurements on Earth. But they refuse to look at that. I've been saying for years, look at the data, day-by-day data, see if they're correlated all over the Earth. These things may be fluctuating. They tell us something. I think, in fact, the constants, the idea that a constant is a relic of this idea that everything's fixed. I think the day will come when every week in nature there's a kind of, like stock market things, you know, this week the charge on the electron's up, gravity is held steady.